some benefit, but overall, that's not been shown. The third thing we talked about in the report, which I want to emphasize, and I've talked to a number of groups of people about this, is that these games are not just totally innocuous. They cost a little money. Usually they don't cost a lot, but if you're on a limited income, this may not be where you want to place your $70 or $80 a year. But I think the biggest problem is these games can be stressful. They look to be fun, but there are all sorts of opportunities for you to compare yourself to other people. And so if you start comparing yourself, and you look at yourself and you say, well, I'm not as good as most of the people who are playing this game for my age, then that becomes a stressful thing. And so you become anxious, and you begin worried about what's happening to your cognition. And there's no evidence that individuals playing that particular game are in fact representative of the population as a whole. And so we have to be careful about these brain stimulation games, which are just everywhere today. And I think we'll see even more of this as time goes on. So this is our report, Cognitive Aging, Progress in Understanding and Opportunities for Action. These are the individuals who supported it, a whole group of individuals. The Knight Brain Foundation really got this started, but then we got a lot of institutes on board in order to complete the report. And this report you can read online for free. There's a hard copy book that you can buy as well. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, or there are others that could answer them. So I'm totally open for questions or discussion or whatever. So, any questions? Any thoughts? Yes?
I have two questions. First, related to the hospitalization.
Yes.
In one hospitalization you mentioned general anesthesia.
Yes.
And I wanted to know if there is a difference in the amount of time that it takes to recover cognitive function. With a patient, for instance, like yourself, who was hospitalized for an ulcer, perhaps you were not put under general anesthesia. Are they separate?
They are. In both cases, you do see a decline. I think being in a hospital is associated with some decline regardless. But if you undergo general anesthesia, you're at a greater risk for decline.
The other question. I read an article recently that talked about a phenomenon named Google brain.
Okay.
And the article, the impetus of the article was the way we multitask today is not necessarily, as a matter of fact, it was described as not good for our brain, that we're better off trying to do one thing at a time and then do things sequentially. What do you say about that?
That's right on target, because there is good evidence that none of us multitask. What we do is very quick switching from one task to the next. We do not multitask. And what that means is we become very distractible in terms of what we do. And we become almost conditioned to that distractibility. So we're pulling out our iPad, this little thing right here, which I've actually kept in my pocket now for 45 minutes without looking at it. We're pulling these things out continually. We're looking at it continually, then we're going back. And we think we're multitasking because we're looking at this, we're looking at the television, we're writing a paper at the same time, but we're not. Okay. We're actually, each task is separate. So I think, I don't know all the details about Google Brain, but the idea that multitasking is bad, I would actually take a step further. I think multitasking is probably a misnomer. I don't think we're multitasking. Someone else? Yes?
So I'm curious to know if you've seen any studies about transcendental meditation or meditation in general?
We did not see any studies I don't remember us having any studies that related transcendental meditation to cognitive aging, as opposed to Alzheimer's disease or as opposed to mild cognitive impairment. We did look at some other types of activities. Dance was one, participation in drama was one, and there were some other, reading groups was one, etc. I think all of those intuitively make a lot of sense and sound good. The evidence, the actual empirical evidence in the literature was limited, and that's why they didn't make our list here. And why our list wasn't more sexy than it was. So, but that, I think that's an area. One issue with transcendental meditation might be if you've got some cognitive decline, it may be a little bit more difficult to participate in transcendental meditation. So you just have to kind of think about, you know, what's happening here. But if you start early, it could make a difference. We just didn't find any studies. Yes.
I was interested in your kind of focus on medication use and its impacts on cognitive aging. And I was wondering if there was discussion within the group about kind of the use of pharmacists as people that should potentially be involved with older adults in reviewing their medications in place maybe of physicians, because physicians are busy, they're doing a lot of other stuff, and pharmacists are probably very well trained to be reconciling a lot of this. I was curious if there was discussion about that.
Unfortunately, we do not have a pharmacist on our committee,
Yeah.
but you're right on target. I think the medication issue is something that's not just a physician-patient issue. It's something that we need multiple checks. I mean, when I was practicing, I must admit that I always paid attention to an alert from a pharmacist because they said, you know, you really want to prescribe this or this, and I think pharmacy needs to be more proactive in this. They don't necessarily need to say, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. But they certainly can say, did you think about this, or did you realize this? And I think getting that information out there can be extremely important. So you're absolutely right. I think pharmacists play a critical role in this. Yes, sir.
So the report mentions there's other kind of dimensions of cognitive function through time, such as wisdom, amount of knowledge acquired.
Yes.
Are there any developing tools or methods or psychometrics of measuring these, and in relation to other factors of cognitive function as well?
There are some empirical approaches to looking at wisdom. These were developed initially in Germany. Paul Maltese was a person who worked a lot on this. There's some others who were involved in it. It's still somewhat in its infancy. What I don't think we know is whether we can measure wisdom. At least we can do an operational definition and use that definition to develop a measure at one point in time. I don't think we necessarily have the best measures to kind of look at it longitudinally. So this is an area that we think, and I think there's some evidence to suggest that it is important. But I think the measures, really longitudinal measures especially, are just not there. Wisdom is again very multifaceted area, not easy to always grasp. But you can make, for example, you can give an individual a scenario, ask them kind of how they think through that scenario, what they might do in that particular scenario, and then there are kind of gradations you can place upon their responses to that, and that would be at least a proxy measure of wisdom. Yes?
Is there time for more questions?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. You pointed to the diversity and the high degree of variability there is in cognitive aging trajectories.
Yes.
And I'm struggling with the question, is there one cognitive aging or is there multiple?
Well, I think there are multiple. I think that's what makes the measurement of this over time difficult. Now, does that mean we just give up on it? Because I think many of the different parameters of cognitive aging actually track pretty closely with one another. So if we can track 2 or 3 of them, we might actually be on top of something that could be important. But it doesn't mean we've got the whole concept captured by 1 or 2 or 3 particular measures. And so it's very multifaceted. My guess is that even the most sophisticated neuropsychological testing really doesn't pick up everything. But I think where we are in our research now is such that we can apply, we've got measures, we can look at those over time, and this is a field that still is somewhat in its infancy, and therefore studies that can be done in this field I think can be extremely helpful to us. Yes?
Your committee made several recommendations for prevention, like physical activity, sleep,
Yes.
blood pressure, and learning. The first three may have some vascular component, but I'm interested in the learning one. Did you maybe look at the mechanism by which learning, opportunities for learning, I think you said was.
We
the
did
strategy.
not look at the mechanisms. We don't know. I mean, I guess you could imagine that the mechanism is you laid down, if you've actually been, let's say, a reader all of your life, and you've been interested and you've been in an educational environment most of your life, you might actually have more connections between the neurons, and therefore when these connections begin to break up, you may have more reserve power given that background. That's a hypothesis. We don't know that to be the case. This is not a cognitive aging study, but it's a study of dementia that I thought was fascinating. It's called the Nun study. How many have ever heard of this study? A few of you have heard it, so let me just review it just briefly. In this study, they were able to get an order of nuns to agree to cognitive testing and an autopsy near the end of their lives. And they were able to identify individuals who clearly had cognitive decline, and they were able to control that with individuals who didn't. Turns out, at the age of like 25, these nuns had written diaries. And so, in a controlled experiment where the people who were looking at the diaries did not know what the outcome was, they found that the nuns who had more simple and less nuanced descriptions of what was going on with them were at greater risk for developing cognitive decline later in life than the individuals who had a richer and more nuanced approach. I think that was a very interesting finding to me. Now that's one study, and we don't know what the rest of them would be, what that might look at. There's no question that Alzheimer's disease hits, it can hit everybody, and it can be very fast progressing for individuals who are at the very top of the intellectual scale as well as individuals who are very low. So I don't want to suggest that this is an all or nothing thing. But there's a trend there that might give us some clues. But in terms of mechanism, we really don't. Yes, maybe one final question.
You talked about brief screening and implementing it into the wellness visits. Are there reliable, good screening measures that could be easily put into this process if the overall recommendation changes?
There are a number of good screening. I shouldn't say good, so I don't evaluate it. There are a number of screening instruments that have been used widely out there that I think could be applied. I think they will change gradually over time, but there's some pretty simple. There's some that are a little bit more complex. There's some that can be administered by telephone. There's some that can be done in an office on your own. There's some that would require a technician to maybe administer the instrument. So there's a whole collection of things out there potentially available. It may not take that difficult a thing. You might ask the person if you are you having any struggles with your memory, and they may say yes or no. Most of them will say no, but then you may ask them just about some civic things. Do you still drive on the interstate? Do you still manage your checkbook, etc.? You can ask a few questions. You can get a clue that way. By far, the best way to do it is to get a family member to come in who knows the individual and says, "If you noticed any change?" And instruments are great; they give you the thing all the time. But talking to a family member will probably get it done, and that can be done very quickly in a wellness visit. It doesn't take a lot. Maybe one final question.
I just have one question. So you talk about we have a general definition of cognitive aging and we need a more operational definition. So how do we progress to getting to that point? Given that, we're going to have this uptake of all these studies, there's a lot of heterogeneity in the tests that people use across studies and samples, and so how do we progress to getting some type of operational definition?
Well, I think one is to look and see what functions. We mentioned a whole collection of functions, all of which there are some tests that are in there. Actually, in DSM-5, there's a whole list of cognitive things that you can use in a particular test that you might use to do that. We don't have the test list, but the functions you do. So one way is to look, see what kind of seems to track with one another. So executive function and memory tend to track. Look at that, see what you might pull up in terms of questions. I think basically, first, I would sort of mine the literature on what's out there, and there's a lot out there, and try to see what comes out of that, see what commonalities you see across all of these. I would again go to DSM-5 because I actually worked on that project also, and there you have a list of things that are considered sort of components of cognition. That would be a place you could look. So I think a good, thorough, critical review of the literature to look for commonalities across these tests would be probably the first place to start. And then look at some of the studies and see what differences you see across studies, what similarities you see across studies would probably be the second step. But I definitely look at just what's out there. There's a lot out there. Well, listen, thank you very much as always.